Every Sunday for 3 years, Gideon Cross visited a grave no one else came to. He never told his board. He never told his staff. He simply disappeared, the most powerful man in 5 industries, gone quiet every Sunday morning, and drove alone to the one place where none of that power meant anything. Then one gray October morning, he wasn't alone. 2 little girls stood at his son's grave. Identical. One in crimson. One in gold. Dark-haired and still like they had always belonged there. And when he crouched down and asked if they were lost, the girl in red looked at him with his dead son's eyes and said, "We're not lost. We came to see our daddy." This secret is about to change everything. If you love stories that pull at your heartstrings and keep you guessing, join our community by subscribing right now. Now back to the graveside. Gideon Cross walked through the iron archway of Aldenmere Cemetery the way he walked into every room, with the quiet authority of a man who has never been told no. The gravel shifted under his polished shoes. The October sky pressed low and colorless overhead, the kind of sky that doesn't bother with drama because it knows what's already waiting beneath it. He was 64. Silver-haired, black-coated, built by 4 decades of decisions that had moved markets and made governments wait. Somewhere behind him, $12 billion worth of empire was already in motion. He had left it without a word, the way he did every Sunday. The way he had done every Sunday for 3 years. He made this walk every week, rain or clear, because Adrian Cross, beloved son, gone too soon, had no one else coming. Gone at 31. A rain-slick road. A Tuesday night in April. The authorities had closed it in 72 hours and called it an accident, and Gideon had signed the papers and shaken the detective's hand and said nothing, because billionaires do not collapse in front of witnesses. And then he had come here every Sunday since and said everything. He stopped before the headstone. The wind moved. A leaf crossed the path. Then something caught his eye. Color, vivid and wrong against the gray. 2 little girls stood at Adrian's grave. Identical. One in crimson. One in gold. Still as stone, and looking at the headstone with the quiet recognition of people who had been here before. He crouched down. "Are you lost?" The girl in red turned. She had his dead son's eyes, storm gray, deep, unmistakable, and she looked at him with a steadiness no child that small should possess. "We're not lost. We came to see our daddy." The girl in gold reached into her coat pocket. What she pulled out was silver. Small. And the moment Gideon saw it, his hands began to shake, because it had belonged to his wife. He had given it to his son. And it had no business being here, in the hands of children he had never known existed, unless Adrian had put it there himself. Unless the accident was never an accident at all. The 43rd floor of Cross Tower did not have a view. It had a verdict. From where Gideon stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass, Manhattan spread below him like a circuit board, ordered, luminous, endlessly processing, and every light in it was connected, in some traceable way, to a decision he had made. The telecommunications grid running under 6th Avenue. The infrastructure bonds financing the new Eastern Corridor. The private equity positions quietly reshaping 4 emerging markets while the rest of the world read about something else. $12 billion did not sit still. It moved constantly, the way blood moves, without asking permission, without stopping to grieve. His office reflected none of him. That was by design. No photographs. No personal effects. A desk of black stone, chairs of cold leather, walls the color of a sky just before it decides what kind of day to be. The only softness in the room was the light, and even that was calibrated, warm enough to suggest humanity, controlled enough to remind visitors they were in the presence of something that had long since moved past needing their approval. His assistant had stopped asking how he was. The good ones always did, eventually. The official story of Adrian's death lived in a single manila folder in the bottom drawer of that black desk. Gideon had read it once, the night it arrived, and had not opened it since. He did not need to. He had memorized it the way you memorize something you intend to disbelieve. Every word logged, every detail filed, the whole clean architecture of it held up against the light and found, repeatedly, to be without visible flaw. Tragic accident. Rain compromised visibility. Single vehicle. No suspicious circumstances. Case closed. The detective had been thorough. The report had been prompt. Everyone had been very, very sorry and very, very efficient, and Gideon had thanked them all and signed where they asked him to sign, because that was what you did when you were the kind of man who understood that the world does not pause for private catastrophe. You signed. You shook hands. You returned to the 43rd floor. You did not say, "This took 72 hours and my son had been telling me for months that someone inside my company wanted him quiet." You did not say that because you had told your son he was paranoid. Because you had chosen the company's version of events over your son's instincts. Because when the detective handed you the clean story, some small and exhausted part of you had reached for it with both hands. Not because you believed it, but because the alternative required a reckoning you were not yet ready to survive. 3 years later he was still not ready. He was simply better at containing it. The grief lived in him the way structural damage lives in a building. Invisible from the outside, load-bearing, discovered only when something pushes hard enough against the right wall. He carried it through board meetings and earnings calls and state dinners and bilateral negotiations, and no one saw it because Gideon Cross had spent 40 years building a face that showed people exactly what he chose to show them, and grief was not on the approved list. Only on Sundays did the face come off. Only at the grave, alone, where there were no witnesses and no verdicts and no clean manila folders, did he allow himself to be what he actually was beneath the overcoat and the empire and the $12 billion. A father. A father who had chosen wrong. A father who was still choosing, every day in every silence, to live with it. He had not meant to move closer. It was the eyes that did it. The eyes that pulled him forward the way a man leans toward a flame he knows will burn him. Not from recklessness, but from the deep, irrational need to be certain of what he is seeing. He had taken 3 steps toward them before he realized he was moving at all. Up close, the resemblance was not subtle. It was not the kind of thing you could dismiss as coincidence or chalk up to the tricks grief plays on a tired mind. He had tried that in the first seconds, told himself that any dark-haired children would look this way against a gray October sky, that loneliness had a way of manufacturing ghosts in the faces of strangers. He had tried it and failed, because grief is one thing and evidence is another. And what stood before him now was evidence. They had Adrian's nose, straight and fine, slightly upturned at the tip in a way that had made Miriam call him her little aristocrat when he was small. They had his jaw, the delicate set of it, the jaw that belonged on a portrait rather than a person. They had his coloring, that particular shade of pale that wasn't sickly but luminous, as though the light moved through them rather than landing on them. And then the eyes. Always back to the eyes. Storm gray. Not blue-gray, not silver-gray, the specific almost impossible shade that Gideon had only ever seen on Adrian, and before Adrian on Miriam, and before Miriam on no one. It was a family color. A private one. The kind of physical detail that doesn't scatter randomly into the world. It passes down, deliberately, blood to blood, generation to generation, like a signature no one can forge. These children had not forged it. He crouched down to their level. His knees protested the cold ground. He didn't notice. "Where are your parents?" he asked. He kept his voice even. He had spent 40 years keeping his voice even. The girl in crimson, the one who had spoken first, the one who carried herself with the faint, serious authority of a child who has been the older one her entire life, looked at him without blinking. "Our mommy brought us," she said. "She's waiting by the gate." "And your father?" Neither girl answered immediately. They looked at each other, a glance that moved between them like a current, fast and private and complete, the way twins communicate in the space beneath language. Then the girl in gold turned back to him, and something in her expression shifted. Not grief exactly. Something older than grief. Something that had already passed through grief and come out the other side into a quieter, more permanent place. She looked at the headstone. Gideon followed her gaze. Adrian Cross. Beloved son. Gone too soon. When he looked back at her, she was still watching him. "That's our daddy," she said simply. The words landed without drama, without performance. The flat, factual delivery of a child stating something she had known her entire life and assumed, until this moment, that everyone else already knew too. Gideon did not move. He did not speak. He was aware of the wind, and the cold through his overcoat, and the distant sound of a car on the road beyond the cemetery walls. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way he hadn't been since the night they called him about Adrian. "What are your names?" he asked. His voice, for the first time in a very long time, was not entirely even. The girl in red placed her hand over her chest. "Ilara." The girl in gold did the same. "Eloan." A pause. Brief and absolute and deliberate. "And we're Cross," they said together. The ground did not move. But something did. Something beneath the composed, armored, controlled surface of Gideon Cross shifted on its foundation. The way a building shifts before anyone on the street can see it, deep and structural and irreversible. He looked at these two children. At the eyes he had buried 3 years ago. At the name that was his name, their name, the name on the stone behind them. For the first time in 40 years of boardrooms and battles, Gideon Cross had nothing to say. He was still crouching when Eloan reached into her coat pocket. The movement was small and unhurried, the casual reach of a child retrieving something familiar, something she had carried long enough that the weight of it had become ordinary to her. But the object she produced was not ordinary. It had not been ordinary since the day Miriam had pressed it into a young man's palm and told him to keep it close. Silver. Small. Oval-shaped, worn smooth along the edges where decades of careful hands had touched it. Gideon recognized it before she had fully extended her arm. The air left his lungs in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He had given that locket to Adrian the year after Miriam died. Adrian had been 13, too young to know what to do with grief and too old to be allowed not to try. Gideon had pressed it into his son's hand the same way Miriam had pressed it into his, without words, because there were none large enough. Adrian had worn it for years. And then, at some point, he had stopped, or Gideon had stopped noticing, and Gideon had assumed it was in a drawer somewhere, in the quiet, undisturbed archive of things that belonged to the dead. It was not in a drawer. It was in the palm of a 4-year-old girl in a gold coat, being held out to him with both hands and the grave solemnity of someone completing a task they were given long before they understood what it meant. "Mommy said to give this to you," Eloan said. "She said you'd know what it was." He took it. His hands were steady. He made them be steady. The locket was lighter than memory had made it. He turned it once in his fingers, tracing the engraved edge, the small clasp on the side. Then he opened it. The photograph on the left was Miriam, young, laughing, caught mid-turn in a garden somewhere, the way she always appeared in photographs, as though the camera had to chase her. He had not seen her face at that size in years. He looked at it for exactly 1 second, which was all he allowed himself, and then he looked at the right side of the locket. Where the photograph should have been, there was paper, folded twice, pressed flat, filled with handwriting so small it was almost invisible, but not invisible to him. Not that handwriting. He would have recognized it on the back of a receipt, on a fogged window in the dark. He unfolded it. "If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Trust no one at the top. Protect them. Protect them." He read it once. Then again. Then a third time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something easier to carry. They did not rearrange. And then the thing he had spent 3 years not thinking about rose up all at once. Not slowly, not mercifully, but all at once, the way a structure collapses when the last load-bearing wall gives way. Adrian, 18 months before he died, sitting across from him in the boardroom on the 42nd floor. Pale and urgent and certain in the way only Adrian ever got certain. That particular set to his jaw, the one that looked so much like Miriam's it was almost unbearable. Talking about offshore accounts. About numbers that vanished between 1 quarter and the next. About executives he had trusted for a decade. "Dad, someone inside the company is stealing. I need you to listen." And Gideon had looked at his son, his brilliant, passionate, occasionally impulsive son, and he had said the words he would spend the rest of his life trying to unlearn. "You're overworked. You're seeing patterns that aren't there. Let it go. Let it go." He had looked his son in the eye and told him his instincts were wrong. He had taken the most important warning he would ever receive and filed it under paranoia, under youth, under the manageable category of things that did not require his immediate attention. 3 weeks later, Adrian had stopped bringing it up. Gideon had taken that as resolution. It had not been resolution. It had been a young man realizing his father would not protect him, and deciding, quietly and alone, to protect himself instead. To fold a note. To place it in a locket. To give it to someone he trusted with the only 2 things that mattered. Gideon's hands were no longer steady. He closed his fingers around the locket and looked up at the 2 girls watching him. Storm-gray eyes, patient and waiting, as though they had always known this moment was coming and had simply been giving him time to arrive at it. He had dismissed his son. He had dismissed him, and someone had taken that silence as permission, and Adrian was in the ground 6 feet behind him. The guilt did not arrive like a wave. It arrived like a verdict. He stayed crouched on the cold ground longer than he should have. The locket was still in his fist. The note was still in his other hand. The girls were still watching him with that unnerving patience, the patience of children who have learned early that adults sometimes need a moment before they can be useful again. He had built an empire on the principle that information, once received, must be acted on immediately. That hesitation was the luxury of men with less to lose. He had never felt less capable of acting in his life. He refolded the note. Carefully, precisely, along its original creases. The creases Adrian's fingers had made. He placed it back inside the locket and closed it, and pressed it into his coat pocket where it settled against his ribs like something with a pulse. Then he looked at Alara. "You said your mother brought you," he said. "Where is she?" Something moved across Alara's face. The composure held. This child had remarkable composure, the kind that is not natural but constructed, built piece by piece over a short life that had required it. But beneath it, for just a moment, something younger and more frightened surfaced and then was pressed back down. "She was supposed to come with us," Alara said. "But she didn't," Eloan added quietly. Gideon looked between them. "She's waiting at the gate?" Alara shook her head. The movement was small and precise and devastating. "She brought us to the gate on Friday," she said. "She told us to wait at the bench by the big tree and not to talk to anyone except you. She said she'd come back." A pause, so brief and so controlled it made his chest ache. She didn't come back. The October air seemed to drop several degrees. "How did you get here today?" Gideon asked. He kept his voice level. He was already thinking. "Mrs. Holloway from the building," Eloan said. "She checks on us sometimes. We told her we needed to come see our daddy's grave and she brought us." She looked at her shoes. "We didn't tell her the other part." "What other part?" Alara met his eyes. "That Mommy's been gone since Friday and we've been alone." 2 days. These children had been alone for 2 days, in an apartment somewhere in the city, waiting for a woman who had not come home. And they had not panicked. They had not told a neighbor the full truth. They had done exactly what they had been told. Come to the grave, find the man with silver hair, give him the locket. Their mother had prepared them for this, which meant their mother had known this was coming. Gideon rose to his feet. His mind had already moved 3 steps ahead, the way it always moved in a crisis, cold and fast and utterly without sentiment, the part of him that had survived 40 years of ruthless business by treating every problem as a sequence of decisions rather than an event to be experienced. The girl's mother had not simply left. She had been taken, or she had run, or both. And either way, whoever had silenced Adrian 3 years ago now knew these children existed. They had to. The dark car he had noticed earlier, idling high on the hill between the trees, it had not been there when he arrived. He was certain of that now in the way you become certain of things too late. They had been watching. Perhaps not just today. He looked down at Alara and Eloan. They looked back up at him. In their faces he saw Adrian. His jawline, his eyes, his particular brand of quiet courage that had always looked like stubbornness from a distance, and beneath that he saw something that cut deeper than resemblance. They were afraid. They were hiding it with everything they had, but they were afraid, and they were 4 years old, and they were alone. He had failed their father by doing nothing. He was not going to fail them. "I need you both to stay very close to me," he said. His voice carried the particular quality it carried in boardrooms when a decision had been made and the time for discussion was over. "Can you do that?" Both girls nodded immediately. No hesitation. No questions. They stepped toward him with the trust of children who have been told, by someone they believed completely, that this man was safe. He took their hands, one small hand in each of his, and he did not look back at the grave. He had said everything he needed to say to Adrian. Everything else now would have to be said in action. He walked them toward the gate, his phone already in his hand, already dialing the only number in his contacts he trusted without condition. Marcus Webb, his head of private security, a man who had worked for him for 22 years and whose loyalty Gideon had tested in ways most men never had cause to test. "Marcus," he said when the line picked up on the second ring, "I need the estate secured within the hour. Full protocol. And I need you to meet me at the east gate of Aldenmere Cemetery in 10 minutes. A pause. "And Marcus, tell no one. Not one person inside the building. No one at the top." He ended the call. Behind him, high on the hill, the dark car was gone. That was worse. He waited until the girls were asleep before he opened the files. The estate was secured by 9 that evening. Perimeter cameras active. 2 of Marcus's best men on rotating shifts at the gate. The east wing locked and alarmed with the girls inside it under the watch of a woman Marcus had used before and trusted with his life. Gideon had sat with Alara and Eloan through dinner. Through the bewildered, exhausted silence of 2 children deposited without warning into a house large enough to swallow the only world they had ever known. He had not tried to explain too much. He had simply stayed close because that was what they needed, and it was the one thing he was beginning to understand, that he had never been good enough at giving. When their breathing finally slowed and the lights in the east wing went quiet, he went to his study and closed the door and pulled 3 years of Cross Industries financial records onto his desk. He did not call his CFO. He did not call his legal team. He called no one because Adrian's note had been very specific on that point. And Adrian had been right about everything else. He started where Adrian would have started, at the seams. Not the headline numbers, not the audited summaries that existed to be seen and believed, but the connective tissue between them. The transfer records. The subsidiary accounts. The routing structures that most board members never looked at because they were designed by the people who built them to be invisible. It took him 4 hours to find the first thread. A dormant subsidiary in the Cayman Islands, Cross Meridian Holdings, incorporated 6 years ago, listed in the annual report as a legacy real estate vehicle, had received 47 transfers over 30 months totaling just under $19 million. The transfers were small enough individually to move beneath the threshold that would have triggered automatic review. They were structured, he realized, by someone who understood the threshold intimately, by someone who had helped design it. He pulled the authorization signatures. He sat very still for a long moment. The name at the bottom of the earliest transfers was not an enemy. It was not a rival, not a hostile acquisition target. Not one of the faceless institutional adversaries he had spent his career outmaneuvering. It was Raymond Holt, his CFO of 14 years, the man who had stood beside him at Adrian's funeral with red eyes and a hand on his shoulder and said, "We'll get through this, Gideon, we'll get through this together." He kept pulling threads. By 2 in the morning he had found 3 more names. Each one hit with the specific nauseating force of a betrayal that has been hiding inside a loyalty. His head of legal operations, his senior acquisitions director, and beneath them both, structuring the routing, designing the invisibility, a forensic architect whose fingerprints were on every transfer but whose name appeared on none of them directly, because he had been careful and meticulous, and he had known exactly how Gideon's oversight systems worked because he had built them himself. His deputy chairman, a man named Elliot Crane, a man Gideon had promoted 4 times, defended publicly twice, and trusted in the way you trust the load-bearing walls of a building, without ever stopping to inspect them. Adrian had brought him Elliot's name 18 months before he died, had sat across from him in that boardroom and said it plainly, without theatrics, the way Adrian always delivered the things that mattered most. Gideon had told him he was overworked. He closed the files. He did not close them because he was finished. He was nowhere near finished. but because there is a limit to how much a man can absorb in a single night without losing the precision he will need to act on what he knows. Grief is a distraction. Rage is a distraction. He had spent 40 years learning to set both aside until the work was done. He set them aside now. He stood at the window of his study and looked out at the dark grounds of the estate, at the faint outline of Marcus's man making his quiet circuit of the perimeter, and beyond him at the black October sky pressing down over everything. Somewhere in the east wing, 2 little girls were sleeping with their father's eyes closed. Somewhere inside Cross Industries, 4 men were going about their lives, believing they had been careful enough and that the only person who had ever known the truth was buried in Aldenmere Cemetery. They were wrong. And come Monday morning, Gideon Cross was going to walk back into that building, through the same lobby, up the same elevator, into the same corner office on the 42nd floor, and he was going to smile at every one of them. He was going to shake their hands. He was going to sit across from them in the same boardroom where his son had once tried to warn him, and he was going to give them absolutely no reason to believe that anything had changed. Because the most dangerous thing a powerful man can do is let his enemies believe they are still safe. He noticed the car on Wednesday. Not because it was obvious, it wasn't. Whoever was behind it was competent enough to rotate positions, vary the distance, never park in the same place twice. A less practiced I would have missed it entirely. But Gideon had spent 4 decades in rooms where the most dangerous thing present was rarely the most visible thing, and he had developed, through no particular intention, the peripheral awareness of a man who has made enough enemies to know that comfort is just inattention with better furniture. It was a black sedan. Unremarkable make, plates he couldn't read at distance. It had been outside the restaurant on Tuesday evening when he left his dinner with the infrastructure minister, a meeting he had told no one about except his assistant and Marcus. It was on the opposite side of the street from his building Wednesday morning when his car arrived at 7:15. And it was idling in the parking structure across from Cross Industries at 6 in the evening when he left, 3 floors below where it should have been ticketed and removed. It was the same car from the cemetery hill. He was certain of it on Thursday, when Marcus confirmed what Gideon had already concluded. The plates were cycling, swapped every 48 hours, registered to a shell company incorporated in Delaware with no discoverable human principle. This was not the work of a private investigator. It was not the anxious surveillance of a single frightened man checking his exposure. This was organized, resourced, and patient. Someone had known he would come to the cemetery that Sunday. He sat with that for a long time. They had not followed him from his home. Marcus had reviewed the estate footage and found nothing before the cemetery visit, which meant they had known the destination in advance, which meant they knew about the Sunday ritual, which meant they had been watching him at some level for longer than this week, long enough to map his habits, to identify the one place he went without staff or security, to choose it as the location for whatever this opening move was meant to accomplish. The dark car on the hill had not been surveillance after the fact. It had been surveillance before. They had known the girls were coming. Perhaps they had followed the girls. Perhaps they had known about Alara and Eloan long before Gideon had, and had been waiting, the same patient, architectural waiting he had found in the financial transfers, to see what would happen when the pieces finally touched. Which meant the locket, the note, the girls arriving at that grave on that particular Sunday morning. None of it had gone unobserved. He felt the cold move through him that had nothing to do with the season. He did not increase his security presence. He did not vary his schedule. He did not do anything that would signal to the people in the black sedan that the geometry of the situation had shifted. Instead, he continued to arrive at Cross Industries at 7:15. He continued to smile at Raymond Holt in the corridor. He continued to sit across from Elliot Crane in the Wednesday strategy meeting and discuss fourth-quarter projections with the attentive, measured engagement of a man with nothing on his mind but business. And every evening he returned to the estate, checked on the girls, sat with them through dinner, and then went to his study and continued dismantling 3 years of carefully constructed invisibility one transfer record at a time. The men in the black car believed they were watching a grieving billionaire who had just received a shock and didn't know what to do with it. They were, in fact, watching a man who had spent 40 years learning exactly how to appear to be doing nothing while doing everything. He had built an empire that way. He intended to dismantle one the same way. On Friday morning he arrived at the office 12 minutes early, rode the elevator to 42, and stood for a moment at the floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the city. The same window Adrian had stood at years ago, trying to show his father what he could see. He understood the view now. He pressed one hand flat against the glass, and he made his son a promise he intended to keep with every resource, every contact, every ruthless and accumulated capability of a lifetime spent learning how power actually moves. Then he turned, straightened his jacket, and went to work. It happened on a Saturday, just before dawn. Marcus came to his door at 5:12 in the morning. 3 quiet knocks, the signal they had agreed on for situations that required immediate attention without alarm. Gideon was already awake. He had not slept past 4 in 11 days. A motion sensor on the north perimeter had been tripped at 4:57. The camera covering that section had gone dark 9 minutes before that. Not malfunctioned, not lost signal, but been interrupted at the source by someone who knew where it was and how to reach it without triggering the adjacent sensors. Marcus's man had found evidence of approach through the tree line. Compressed ground, a discarded earpiece, a clean cut in the outer fence that had been made with professional equipment and then partially closed again to delay discovery. Someone had come to the edge of the estate and then, for reasons Gideon could only interpret as either caution or communication, a message rather than an action, had stopped. They had come close enough to take the girls. They had chosen not to. Not yet. "We move in the hour," Gideon said. He went to the east wing himself. Alara was already sitting up in bed when he opened the door, her dark eyes alert in the gray pre-dawn light with that particular watchfulness he had come to recognize as her default, the vigilance of a child who had learned that the world required monitoring. Eloan was curled beside her, still half asleep, one hand fisted in the blanket. He crouched at the edge of the bed. "We're going somewhere else today," he said quietly. "Somewhere safer. I need you to be very brave for about 30 minutes and then you can sleep again." Alara studied him for a moment with Adrian's eyes. Then she reached over and shook her sister's shoulder. "Eloan, Grandpa needs us to be brave." Eloan sat up without complaint, without tears, without a single question that would slow them down. She simply looked at Gideon, nodded once, and reached for her shoes. He did not have the words for what moved through him in that moment. He filed it away and kept moving. Marcus had a safe house 40 minutes north, a property held under a name with no connection to Cross Industries, purchased 3 years ago during a period when Gideon had briefly, privately, acknowledged that the circumstances of Adrian's death might one day require a contingency. He had hoped never to use it. He drove there himself, Marcus in the passenger seat, the girls in the back with a bag of clothes and the small, specific collection of objects they had each insisted on bringing. Alara, a worn paperback with a cracked spine. Eloan, a drawing she had made 2 days earlier of a man with silver hair holding 2 small hands. He had not been able to look at that drawing for long. In the weeks that followed, something shifted between them in the particular unannounced way that real things shift. Not in a moment but across many small ones. He learned that Alara read the way Adrian had read, with total absorption, entire afternoons disappearing into pages. He learned that Eloan asked questions the way Adrian had asked questions, not to be answered but to think aloud, to turn a problem in the light until she could see all its surfaces. He learned that they argued with each other in complete sentences and apologized without being prompted and noticed, with an accuracy that unnerved him, when he was carrying something he hadn't spoken. One evening Eloan looked up from her dinner and said, without preamble, "You're sad today. A different sad than usual." He had looked at her across the table, this small, precise, impossibly perceptive child who had her father's jaw and her grandmother's eyes and her own entirely original soul, and he had not tried to deny it. "Yes," he said. "A different sad." She had nodded, satisfied, and returned to her food. And somehow that small, unremarkable exchange had reached somewhere the locket and the note and the financial records had not quite reached. Some room inside him that had been locked since April 3 years ago, not dramatically, not with any announcement, but simply, quietly, with the naturalness of a child who had decided he was safe enough to tell the truth to. Adrian had not sent him evidence. Adrian had sent him his children. And somewhere in the understanding of that, Gideon Cross began, for the first time in 3 years, to breathe. He scheduled it for a Thursday. Not Monday, which would have felt urgent. Not Friday, which would have given them the weekend to maneuver. Thursday, midweek, mid-morning, the kind of scheduling that communicates routine, that arrives without the atmospheric pressure of significance. He sent the calendar invitations himself, from his own assistant's account, flagged as a standard quarterly review. He used the same conference room on 42 where he had held 100 such meetings. He asked for coffee service at 10 and lunch to be ordered for 12:30, because men who intend to expose you do not order lunch. Raymond Holt arrived first, as he always did, with his reading glasses already on and a yellow legal pad that Gideon now understood had never once been used for anything it appeared to be used for. Elliot Crane came in behind him, unhurried, with the particular ease of a man who has never in his professional life walked into a room where he was not welcome. The others filed in after legal acquisitions, the 4 men whose names Gideon had found at the bottom of 30 months of careful, patient theft. Gideon was already at the head of the table. He waited until everyone was seated and the assistants had left and the door had closed. Then he opened the leather folder in front of him and slid a single document to the center of the table. A summary sheet, 1 page, clean and precise, the kind of document that takes 4 weeks to prepare and 4 minutes to destroy a person with. "I want to talk about Cross Meridian Holdings," he said. The quality of silence that followed was very specific. It was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of men whose bodies have understood something their faces have not yet been given permission to show. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He sat at the head of the table where he had always sat, in the room where his son had once tried to warn him, and he walked them through it with the methodical, unhurried precision of a man who has had 6 weeks to ensure that every door is closed before he enters. The transfers, the routing structures, the Cayman subsidiary, the authorization signatures, their signatures, reproduced on the summary sheet with the originals attached in the bound exhibit behind it. 74 pages that his forensic accountants had spent 3 weeks making irrefutable. The offshore accounts, now frozen, by order of a federal judge who had received the filing at 7 that morning. 2 hours before anyone in this room had arrived at work. And then, last, he placed Adrian's note on the table. The original. Photographed, authenticated, logged as evidence, but present here in its physical form because Gideon had decided, at some point during the 6 weeks of preparation, that the men who had ordered his son's death should be required to look at his handwriting. Elliot Crane looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Gideon. "You have nothing that connects us two." "I have everything," Gideon said simply. "I have had everything for 5 weeks. I have spent those 5 weeks making certain that what I have is sufficient to ensure that the next rooms the 4 of you occupy are not ones you can leave." He paused. "The federal prosecutors received their copies at 7 this morning. Your attorneys have likely already been contacted." The room did not erupt. There was no shouting, no dramatic collapse. What happened was quieter and more complete than that. The specific deflation of men who have built their safety on the assumption that no one was looking, confronting the reality that someone had been looking for a very long time. Raymond Holt took off his reading glasses and set them on his legal pad and did not pick them up again. Gideon gathered his folder, rose from the table, and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling window one final time. The view his son had stood before, trying to make his father see. "Adrian saw all of this," he said, to no one in particular. "He was 29 years old and he saw every piece of it." He picked up his folder and walked to the door. "He was right," he said. "And I am finishing what he started." He did not look back. 5 years passed the way things pass when you are finally present for them. Not quickly, not slowly, but fully, each part of it landing and being kept. Elliot Crane received 14 years. The others received sentences commensurate with what the evidence demanded, which was considerable, because Adrian had been thorough in the way that only a person who knows they are running out of time can be thorough. The case made the financial press for 3 months and the national press for 1, and then it settled into the permanent record the way true things do, quietly, without needing further argument. The mother, her name was Sarah, and she was found 6 weeks after the board meeting, alive, in the care of a woman in a coastal town 4 hours north who had sheltered her when she ran, came to the estate on a Tuesday afternoon in February with the particular composure of someone who has survived something and not yet decided how to carry it. Gideon had met her at the door himself. They had stood in the entrance hall for a moment, 2 people connected entirely by a man neither of them had been able to save, And then she had looked at him with clear, direct eyes and said simply, "Thank you for keeping them safe." He had not trusted his voice sufficiently to respond. He had nodded, and she had understood, and they had gone inside. Sarah remained in their lives. Present, careful, gradually less braced for things to go wrong, watching Gideon with the calibrated attention of a woman determining, over time and evidence, whether a person is who they appear to be. He did not rush that process. He understood it. He submitted to it the way you submit to things that are right and necessary, without complaint, because her caution was not an obstacle. It was proof that she had loved Adrian well. Ilara and Eloan grew up in the particular way of children who have been through something early. Not damaged by it, or not only damaged by it, but sharpened. Serious in the way that has room for laughter inside it. Curious in a way that had direction. They asked questions about Adrian constantly. Not with grief, or not only with grief, but with the hunger of people assembling someone they deserve to know, and Gideon answered every one of them, sparing nothing, including the parts that reflected badly on himself. Especially those parts. He had decided very early that the only legacy worth leaving them was an honest one. The Adrian Cross Justice Foundation was Ilara's idea. She was 19 when she proposed it, sitting across from him at the kitchen table of the estate with a 12-page document she had drafted herself, outlining a non-profit that would fund legal resources for whistleblowers inside corporate structures, people who had seen what Adrian had seen and had no mechanism to be believed. She had presented it with the same set to her jaw her father had always had when he was certain of something. That particular stillness that meant the decision had already been made, and she was offering him the courtesy of a conversation rather than the necessity of one. Eloan was already building the financial structure before he had finished reading. He had funded it entirely and without condition and had gone to his study afterward and sat for a long time without turning the lights on. They launched on the 5th anniversary of the board meeting. Gideon did not speak at the event. He sat in the 3rd row and watched his granddaughters stand at a podium in front of 200 people and speak about their father with the fluency of people who have done their grief work and come out the other side into something that can be used, and he held Sarah's words in his mind. "Thank you for keeping them safe," and thought about all the other ways those words could run, all the directions of debt and gratitude that moved between people who had loved the same person. On the Sunday after the launch, he went to Aldenmere Cemetery alone, the way he had always gone. The gravel shifted under his shoes. The sky was doing something generous with the late afternoon light, the kind of October gold that makes the world look briefly like it knows what it is doing. He sat on the bench beside Adrian's grave, a bench he had placed there in the 2nd year, for reasons he had not examined too carefully at the time, and he rested his hands on his knees and looked at the headstone and felt, for the first time in 8 years, something he did not immediately need to manage. Not happiness exactly. Something older and less simple than that. The specific peace of a man who has looked honestly at his failures and done, with the time remaining, what the time allowed. He had not saved his son. He could not save his son. But he had finished what Adrian started, and he had raised Adrian's children in the light he had failed to provide for Adrian himself, and the foundation that bore his son's name would outlast him by decades and do work that mattered in the world. He heard the gravel shift behind him. 2 sets of footsteps. Unhurried, familiar. Ilara sat on his left. Eloan sat on his right. They did not say anything immediately, and he did not require them to, because this was the thing about these two that had undone him most completely over 5 years. Their understanding that presence was its own language, that sometimes the most important thing you could offer a person was simply the fact of your being beside them. The 3 of them sat together in the October light and looked at the headstone and let the silence be what it was. Not empty, not heavy, but full of everything that had brought them here and everything that would continue after. After a long while, Eloan leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Ilara reached over and took his other hand. He sat between the 2 of them in the last of the afternoon light, with the weight of his granddaughters against him and the name of his son carved in stone before him, and he was not healed, because some things do not heal, they simply become part of the architecture, but at peace. He had earned it the hardest way. And it was enough. A father's grief turned into a miracle he never saw coming. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe to help us share more stories of hope and redemption. What would you have done in his shoes? Let us know in the comments.